You are listening to MCC Geopod, the geopolitical podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
Good morning to our listeners. Welcome to today's studio podcast. I'm sitting in the studio with Mr. Ruslan Bortnik, who is the head of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics, and Dr. Attila Demkó, who is the head of the Center for Geopolitics at MCC. I have several questions to you. The first one is, what do you think, what are the key factors driving Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and how have they evolved over time?
It is not so easy question as it looks for the first sight, as it mass media wrote and so on. Of course, the main factors are the Russian geopolitical ambitions and the age of Russian leadership. Putin is hurrying up to build the new great Russian state before Putin off his position. But also, the great influence of this conflict made a few other factors. Of course, we are talking about the fighting of two ways of globalizations. The American Western liberal globalization and Chinese economic globalization, which were fighting and still fighting in the mind of all around the world. Of course, very important factor is COVID. COVID, which pushed a lot of issues, deep problems in economics, politics, and so on the international table. And COVID pushed our world economy to the threshold of maybe a new crisis. And the war is very usual way of resolution of different type of crises on the human history, unfortunately. Of course, we are talking about maybe the fourth industrial revolution. Look what is going with the chat GDP and another process, which are changing our life on our eyes. And we even don't understand what the final of this revolution. Maybe in the starting of this process is in geopolitical, of course, levels. And of course, the problem with so-called frozen conflict of when the Minsk agreement on Ukraine, on Donbass, were not fulfilled, and the balance inside of Ukraine, political balance between the West and East was changed finally. It also made a great influence for the reason in this conflict. In any case, we are talking from the scientific side. In any case, of course, Russia made a criminal thing, absolutely criminal thing, because any reason will not trust the invasion to other country and so many losses from the civilians, what we have nowadays in Ukraine. The war, unfortunately, of course, the fastest tool of changing the policy due our human history. But at the same time, war is the most dangerous tools because not always war leads to some kind of progress and development. Sometimes war leads in our history to the deep and very deep regression of human civilization.
Well, I completely agree with Ruslan, and I think one of the main factors beyond COVID, beyond the belief that the West is weak, is the feeling of let's say, making history for Putin. That he wanted to make history. He wanted to become one of the greats of Russian history, like Peter the Great or Ivan the Terrible. And I think he will be more like Ivan the Terrible at the end. But it was also driven by a feeling of decline. That Russia is on a declining path in terms of demography, for sure. But also in terms of economy, it's not catching up really to the West or China. And he wanted to increase the numbers of Russians. And actually, you can see on some of his policies also taking people, not only taking territory. So taking the human resources of Ukraine. We always talk about coal or gas or oil or other things, but human resources is what Russia is really missing, not minerals. Russia is the richest country in minerals anyway, so what Ukraine can offer is not that important. People talk about the salt mines in Bakhmut and Soledar. Of course, these are very important salt mines, but that's humans are more important, and I think that is one of the reasons, and also his idea of what Russia is, and he sees parts of Ukraine, and I think from his part this is a very deep belief. So this is not artificial, that Crimea or southern parts of Ukraine are actually Russia, and those people should be Russians. So and of course it's a total illusion, and I think Ukrainian people are proving every day with this fierce resistance that they don't want to become Russians, or at least most of them, because some are supporting Russia, to be very honest, in some regions even a lot, but not the majority in places like Kherson or Zaporizhzhia, definitely not the majority. So and elsewhere it's very, very negligible, small numbers, especially in Western Ukraine. So I think Putin is proven wrong in his idea what Russian nation is and what the Ukrainian nation is every day, but still that was his idea. And that's the dangerous thing in this aggression, that it's driven not only by small-scale interest or money, but by deep beliefs in what Russia is, what Ukraine is or is not, what the West is, and how Russia can be great again. And I think it was not only a criminal act, because that is one thing, but also a geopolitical mistake very rarely seen by Putin. So, but it doesn't change the fact that now we are in this war, and actually there is less and less opportunity for Putin to finish this war with favorable terms. So that means that unfortunately this war is becoming an existential war for Vladimir Putin and his regime, especially after the ICC as a decision. So I see it in that term, in history, in what Russian identity, and also a feeling of vengeance and frustration against the West.
Yeah, it is a general truth that creating illusions and using propaganda has an unimaginable effect on people's minds. Now, how has the use of disinformation and propaganda affected the conflict, and what steps can be taken to mitigate its impact? What do you think?
I don't know where you have taken these questions, but all of them are very difficult. Propaganda is not only straight thin, because from the one side, propaganda is very useful for the state which is in the fight. Propaganda mobilized a lot of Ukrainians to fight, to defend our country. But from this side, propaganda is very useful. It is fact, unfortunately, for our democratic view even. But from the other side, propaganda divides the world for the white and black. And propaganda makes impossible to make any compromises. And we are talking not only about such kind of negotiation between Russia and Ukraine, but we are talking about the negotiation between Ukraine and other countries. We have a lot of problems with other countries also. And I think it's our expert task to understand that the role of propaganda, but at the same time to help society to find more colors in policy, to help society to find the rational, pragmatical ways, exit strategy from the conflict also.
Well, I'm sorry to say that I fully agree again. Let's hope that we can debate on something. So I think, yeah, propaganda is definitely a tool, And usually we talk about Russian propaganda, which is a fact that Russia is using propaganda within its own borders and outside of Russia, including the NATO nations, EU nations. And this war was explained by some propaganda panels. Like most of them were actually lies or very big exaggerations, like the issue of in Hungary, they managed to make people believe that 14,000 Russians were killed by the Ukrainians, the Russian minority. So many Hungarians actually believe that there was a massacre before the invasion. And it was a successful propaganda operation, and in some other countries too, that Russia had reasons to attack. Of course, in 2014 and 15, there were incidents. For example, in Hungary, it worked because we have, and maybe we will talk about that, we have problems. There were attacks in Subcarpathia by Ukrainian nationalists against the Hungarian minority, but that made it believable. And we have to fight this misinformation that thousands of Russians were killed by Ukrainian nationalists, which is not true. So, but also, I think, unfortunately, and I completely agree with this conflict is becoming a totally black and white issue. Fight with the evil empire, like in before the Second World War, or in the Second World War with Hitler's Germany, and it makes really negotiations at one point very hard, because how you negotiate with someone who is a war criminal, it's very hard. But the problem with wars are that they usually end in negotiations. They end in peace negotiations, not in full victory for one side. So that's why for that reason I found some of the Western ideas also dangerous, because the room of maneuver is much smaller. And actually, if we don't end this war, and of course, I'm not saying that Ukraine, of course, shouldn't give up any territory. So the basic idea is the Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. But if we don't end this war and it continues for years and years and maybe even for decades, it can slow down, but it can continue possibly quite long. Then the country which is destroyed most is not Russia, but it's Ukraine. But again, even if I'm saying this, I'm on dangerous terrain with some, because then I will be accused of, let's say, promoting Munich or negotiating with the devil. But unfortunately, the realities are that most wars are not finished like the Second World War was finished, with the Soviet flag in Berlin and the Americans in Tokyo. Because that was a totally different time, a time without nuclear weapons, or with America having a very limited number of nuclear weapons. And today we have a country with not a limited number of nuclear weapons, that is called Russia. And there is another one which is backing Russia, a big country called China, and we are just after the visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow. So if we believe that Russia is alone in this adventure, because that's also what sometimes Western ideas, and I may say it's not propaganda, but belief or information bubble says that Russia is alone. And actually, if we believe this, then we are on a very bad path, since Russia has China, Russia has Iran, Russia has many of the African countries. I just came back from Africa, and there is a totally different view in Africa about the war, especially South Africans see it and South Africa is an important country, in a different way. And several African countries just switched to support Russia from being a neutral country. So we have to, or as analysts, we have to be very clear that information bubble, I don't call it Western propaganda, Western information bubble is also dangerous. And of course, Russian propaganda we have to fight. And they are not sophisticated, Russian propagandists, but they can be quite good in delivering messages in every country. So it's an issue we have to fight, and we have to fact check basically everything what is coming from Russian sources. But we also have to be very balanced and cool-headed in the West.
The problem, I will add something. The problem is propaganda in that if you using only propaganda and you are in informational bubble, your decision will be made from the wrong origins. Even with the best feelings, with the best goals, you will make the wrong decision because you are empty of that really real information. And from the wrong information, from the propaganda information, you will make the very wrong decision at the finally. So in any case, when we are talking about the elites should be very rational, and elite should be over the propaganda in any case, even in the situation of the war.
Yeah, when experts like you are talking about the war, or when we're studying about it at university, I always get the feeling that I might know the facts, I might know the layout, but I could never imagine what it's like to live in such a country. And people like us living in peace only see videos on the internet about wounded soldiers and the drafting themselves. But Ruslan, I'm really curious about your adventures, about the stories you've heard or the things that you've seen in Ukraine. So my question is, how has the conflict impacted civilians in Ukraine, including like displacement and human rights and access to humanitarian aid and these violations?
Before answering your question, I want to add that every war starts in the mind. So be careful with the minds around, politician minds, and every war starts suddenly. Suddenly. Of course, we expert knew about this war will be. In December 2021, I said in public in few TV shows that war will be. We should be prepared for this. But one thing to understand that war will be, another thing to accept this. Because your head, your mind understands it, but your soul didn't want to accept it. It's very strange feeling. Only people in the war should understand it. I think. When we are talking about the impact of this war, of course, the negative impact of this war is extremely huge, because we are talking about losing of 35% of Ukrainian GDP. We are talking about 8 million refugees from Ukraine abroad. We are talking about not less than 5 till 7 for nowadays. It was much bigger in the beginning. Replaced persons inside of Ukraine. And we are talking about the damage for Ukraine starting from 500,000 billions dollars and in the $1 trillion dollars. It's extremely huge damage. Of course, more than 30% of Ukrainian territory is polluted, mined and just polluted because of war in the territory. Near 18% of Ukrainian territory is just occupied for nowadays. War took all the lives more than 10 hundreds of civilians, Ukrainians, and we don't know correctly, but I think near 100,000 lives of soldiers in Ukraine. The losses is, I think, comparable with Russian losses. Ukrainian losses is comparable. So this damage is extremely huge, and I think even with after the Ukrainian victory, we are not be able, with all international support, we are not be able to cover the losses even for the generation.
Well, I spent, there is this war going on for more than a year, so like 400 days now around. And I spent from that 400 days only 3 days in Ukraine. And even that was very far from the front line. But even in that part of Ukraine, I could see the impact of war with the lack of electricity. It was really an eerie sight when a big town of 200,000 people is in darkness. And and you just see when the generators start and lights are coming back in some places and other places not. So the impact is everywhere in Ukraine, from the west to the west also, not only on the east and south and north. And people live, as I saw, it was only 3 days, in fear. That doesn't mean that they are not ready to resist, but still, air raids, sirens, and blackouts are every daily part of daily life. And before actually this war is since 2014, so I saw the first stage of the war on the front lines in Ukraine in several places. I visited from Popasna down to Shirokina near Mariupol, and I saw the devastation. It's really a terrible sight, and it's really like in a post-apocalyptic movie when you go into such a town. And in Shirokina, which was a beautiful resort town on the Azov Sea, you could see the children's toys in the sand left there. So war came suddenly. Maybe people were having an early spring holiday there when they had to escape. So we could see the normal life becoming a horror in basically maybe in few hours when they escaped these beautiful holiday homes on the seaside. So you could see the children's toys, the bowls, and then you could see how people were having. I could imagine how people were having fun, and at the same time you could hear the explosions nearby. So it was really that 1 or few hours I spent on the front lines of Ukraine taught me one thing: to avoid war by all means. So yes, the impact is extreme, and we don't know, of course, the number of dead, but I think it's tens of thousands of civilians for sure, and definitely, if we look at both sides, it's definitely above 100,000 dead soldiers, but maybe 200,000 if we add the two sides together. So we already approach, or very soon will approach 250,000 lost people in little bit more than a year. And we didn't talk about the many of the wounded who lost leg, who lost arm. You could see that also on the streets of Ukrainian town, that people are on the street who lost a leg, for example. So that's terrible. Yeah. And I think I have to agree that to be realistic, Ukraine lost part of its future already. Even if there is a Russian compensation taken from the Russian assets, if it's possible, even if there is Western help, the lives which were shattered cannot be given back, and that's the biggest thing. That it's not only the bridges, the roads, and not only even the dead and the wounded, but the shattered minds, the shattered families. And this, the enormity of this war, the crime, what this war is really seen when you are in a town and the normality ceases to exist with the blackout. And it's a small thing because then you are in darkness, but it tells you really that it's a different world in Ukraine and all of Ukraine. So it's not only the front lines, of course, near the front lines, it's much worse. But the Russian aggression affected every square meter of Ukraine with that, and it continues.
Attila, you mentioned the phrase Western help, and it just sparked a question in my mind. What do you think, what role have international actors, for example, the US, the EU, and the UN played in the conflict, and what are the prospects for diplomatic efforts to end the war?
Well, I think, to be very honest, and I don't want to hurt Ukrainian feelings, but for sure, without EU and US help, Ukraine wouldn't stand today. So that was not only the military help, but the economic help, and Ukraine will be in need of Western help for quite a long time. And actually, it's not very well known, but Hungary also gave more than 100 million euros so far as in humanitarian aid, and of course contribute to funds within the EU, even for weapons funds so far until the last few days. So that's I think that's a huge help for Ukraine, but I don't think it can be enough to really mitigate the losses of Ukraine. Many things cannot be mitigated, unfortunately. That's the reality. And UN is a bit different, because on the highest level, what really matters in the UN is the Security Council. So the Security Council will never make a decision against Russia, not only because of Russia, but because of China too. And some of the elected members, so not only the permanent members, will side with Russia. That's reality. If you look at the assembly, of course, the assembly is different. Usually are about 140 countries vote with Ukraine, and the others, so about 60 others are either neutral or vote against Ukraine. So there is a majority in the assembly, but assembly's votes are not obligatory to follow up. And Hungary is voting with Ukraine. It's not. I don't think it's very well known in Ukraine, but we always voted with Ukraine and against Russia in the UN Assembly. So what I want to say that actually Ukraine is, if the invasion stops today, which it will not stop today, even in that case, that would be decades. To even with a very huge Western help and possibly Russian, reparations for decades to rebuild, and it's a very big task for any country. So we have seen it on the Balkans. And just one more sentence: I spent 2 weeks in Bosnia. I visited Bosnia quite a few times since 1995, since the Dayton Peace Agreement. And what I noticed in Bosnia this summer, that some parts of Bosnia are simply empty. It's a wilderness. Bosnia lost 25% of its population since the end of the war. So it's very hard to make a country successful after such a war. I'm sure that Ukrainian talent and willingness to sacrifice will help a lot, but still it's an enormous task.
But we did it a few times after the First, Second World War. We have such kind of experience. Of course, it's a very sad experience, but we have, talking about these international influences, they are quite different, because this conflict, this war, is going on a few levels. It's like a Russian doll, matryoshka, because there is a geopolitical competition between China and United States, Russia and West, then Russia and Ukraine. And also we have a part of, competition between different types, two Ukraines, different types of Ukraine, old post-Soviet Ukraine, and new, modern, most right-wing Ukraine. And on all these levels, for the successful resolution of this war, we should make a reasonable decision at one time. And all these decisions should be made on the informational sphere, on the political sphere, and in economic also, to be successful, to be fulfilled. And talking about these influences, we should divide the world for the three big parts. Of course, it's Ukrainian allies, headed by the United States. More than 60 countries today are involved in Ukrainian defense. And these countries help Ukraine a lot with financial and military support. For example, Ukraine obtained for the first year of the war more than 110 billion United States dollars of different kind of support. It's a great support. More than half of Ukrainian state budget system incomes are from the abroad. More than half for today. I think more than half of military supplies are from abroad, from our Western partners. And these countries united in the Ramstein Plus format, in the NATO, in the European Union, helping Ukraine a lot. But there are other countries which are helping for Russia. It's near 10 countries. We are taking into account Belarus, Iran, China, and so on, and Russian partners on post-Soviet lands, and such Russian partners like Syria or so on. We have another countries. That countries are not neutral, but they just not involved in conflict. But the bigger part of the world trying to sell their position, try to find their national interest in this war, and sell and trading with the West and Russia at the same time. Very often, this are not involved with part of the war is very important because. If we are talking on the highest level or the level of geopolitical competition for these countries of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and nowadays China leads the fight with the United States of influence for these countries. So this influence are not the same. It's not has no the one path of this influence. And this is also a reason why this war is going on and will be going on, because it's a part of huge geopolitical confrontation in which Ukrainian-Russian war may be only one part of this geopolitical confrontation.
Right. And as my last question, it is something more general, more geopolitics oriented. How has the conflict impacted the wider region, including neighboring countries, and geopolitical dynamics more broadly?
Well, I think the big question is in all of this, where exactly China is. So that's the biggest question, and what are Chinese intentions? So if China decides this moment to change the world order, and I think it will find the West in a very weak position, since Ukraine was helped a lot, including militarily, but also there is a financial situation in the West. It does not. I'm not saying that China is not in a weak position comparatively. Compared to the previous times, Chinese economy slowed down. There are very big problems with the construction sector within China. But there is a leadership which was re-established, if not re-elected, officially re-elected, but it's of course we don't know how much is it people's will. But anyway, so there is a quite assertive China, and I think that's the biggest. So let's start from the global level. That's the issue globally where China will stand. It's behind Russia, but to what degree will be behind Russia? And if China uses this moment to exert its influence over Taiwan or push other Chinese projects, or from Chinese perspective, and it's very important, we have to see the other side's perspective. So why Russia is doing this and why China is doing this, and of course for Taiwan, for China is a grievance, and there are many other grievances. It doesn't matter if it's justified or not. That's how China sees it. That Taiwan is a renegade province and is defended by the West against the rightful China, so from the two Chinas, the Republic of China and People's Republic of China. Then that's why it's very dangerous, because if a country believes that it's fully right and it's a Western colonialist project, the support of Taiwan to geopolitically isolate China, then we are in a dangerous situation. That's the big question. And I'm afraid that in a way we will end up with a Chinese, Russian, Iranian alliance with some smaller powers supporting this alliance. And if you look at geopolitics, this is Mackinder's heartland power, exactly. And we don't know really how strong the West is. And again, the information bubble is that the West is 1 billion people and we are so strong, and NATO is how much stronger than Russia, and it's true. NATO is much, much stronger than Russia in everything, NATO countries together. Even EU, in terms of economy, far, far stronger. Militarily, it's the United States which matters, not the EU countries. But looking at the second biggest Swiss bank going down from out of the blue, or almost, there were better articles about Credit Suisse like half a year ago, but I would have never thought. I lived in Switzerland and Credit Suisse was a household name, and now it disappears after 167 years. And also in the US. And I think we are in not such a strong position, since the West very unwisely, and I think the neoconservatives misadventures contributed to this weakness. Iraq, and also the very bad decision to involve ourselves in Libya, also staying in Afghanistan for 20 years. And I think the Biden administration made the right choice, even if that was seen as a weakness by Russia, but still geopolitically it was the right choice. Afghanistan has no real geopolitical significance. That's a legend. So it was a good choice by the Biden administration, but still we did everything, and I'm speaking from a Western perspective, we did everything to undermine our power in the last quarter of a century, especially the neoconservative projects. And the biggest mistake was Iraq by far. So that's the big level. And what about the geopolitics of the region? Well, of course, this region is not united region. And because there are many, usually one speaks about the differences between Hungary and Ukraine, but actually there are much more. So the Balkans is very disunited, a lot of conflicts, and again, minority issues are very important. Language issues are very important. Symbolic issues, statues are very important. We just see in Kosovo the crisis over license plates, and I don't think it's understood in the West that this is a reality in this region, and we have to be very cautious. And I don't think the West understood this. So we have a region again which is not that united, and it created a huge economic potentially a huge economic crisis for the region, since many countries were dependent on Russian oil and gas. So the most dependent actually are Hungary and Slovakia, to some extent Austria. But there are many other countries which were affected very badly on the long term. So what we see, I think, both on the global level and both on the regional level, a much more fragmented and dangerous world. And until we don't see the realities, both on the global level and the regional level, and I think the Western bubble doesn't really seem to understand the realities, the real drivers of either the Chinese or either the Balkan countries or either what Hungary sees differently. Until it's understood well, there will be no answers, and there will be even more misunderstandings within the Western alliance system, but also with China. And it can lead to an even worse situation. So it's easy to be a pessimist. It's very fashionable. And I'm really against being fashionable. I really hate to be fashionable. But I think there is a huge amount of reason to be a pessimist. Both within the region, there are many unresolved conflicts, and both globally, there are many unresolved conflicts. And if we answer the unresolved conflicts with ideology and labeling, then we will not resolve or not even understand the conflict. So So we are in a downward path, and there are bigger forcings also, which is the demographic explosion of Africa and the Middle East, which is a pressure on Europe, and also the climate change issue. So if you add everything together, the Ukrainian war is actually the sign of things to come, the aggression against Ukraine. So I'm afraid that generally we face I call it in one of my articles 7 bad years, but it can be a generational conflict. So a 30 years war, not necessarily a war in Europe, but a 30 years conflict globally. And that coincides again with the climate issues, when we really start to feel climate change, and with the peak of population explosion in Africa. So yes, I think Ruslan was very right to forecast war before, and he was right, and I was wrong, since I didn't forecast war a few months before. But we are right to be pessimistic in every level regarding security in the world.
We have to be pessimistic because our role, experts' role, to make it dangerous, to show the dangers for government, for society, to find the way to resolution of these dangers. Of course, this is not just a war between the countries or even a regional war. It's international war. It's not a world war now, but it's international war now. For me, it's quite clear that Russia was going just to occupy Ukraine. The goal of Russia was absolutely another. Russia wanted to occupy Ukraine to make a security crisis for Europe, for the allies, for the United States. And through this security crisis, Russia planned to push United States to the table to divide the sphere of influence in Europe, in the world. The goal was the monopolar world of this war, not only Ukraine. Ukraine was only a stage of obtaining these goals from the Russian and maybe even Chinese side. So the consequences of this war are also global. I absolutely agree with Attila. Yes, it also happens. But I want to add to his words some more consequences. One of the most scary for me consequence of this war is that we are becoming less and less free, less and less democratic. We are becoming all around the world. We are becoming more and more authoritarian societies and states because of security crisis. Because the main goal of society is to obtain the security, not the democratic rules and human rights for nowadays. It's a very dangerous process, and if the war will go on for many years, I think the old conservative democratic system will be under a big danger of living at all. The second consequence is that maybe the war now on our eyes is divided for two big parts. So-called Eurasian bloc, China, Russia, Iran, and other countries, all do also Mama Kinder, heartland, and the so-called Western bloc, United States and NATO countries against them. And it's a very dangerous process for nowadays, even because it leads to broke the world financial system, world trade system, and that things we are watching on Swiss banks, American banks, it's also consequences of this war. Because a lot of Russian money, we are talking about billions, 100 billions of Russian money, were used in this financial system. They helped it a lot to function in many, many years. Nowadays, the Western financial system are without this money, and the situation of leaking even the money of China and other non-involved countries. They are also trying to take back their money from this system. They also make a challenge I'm talking about the China, to the world role of, for example, of world currency dollar, make a challenge for this role, and they propose his own currency. It's a second part of consequences. And of course, there is a big threat of nuclear, using of nuclear weapon. There is not so realistic for nowadays. But in the future, with continuation of the war, this scenario will be more and more realistic. Because nowadays we have a situation when the war is in the crisis of the war. Due to the military instrument, no one side should obtain their goals. And only the nuclear weapon should change the situation on the battlefield. So this is a big threat for us. In any case, we are not such old world, such very globalized world, which we were lived before, will not be exist in the nearest future.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your thoughts for this great discussion. This was the latest episode of the MCC Geopod.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this MCC Geopod episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.